Okay. In case anyone's actually listening, hello, this is Distant Dat. We're looking at a text by Fujio Mizuoka, and on subsumption and Marxist geography. And yes, I know that sounds all obtuse and stuff, but I think you'll see how much sense it actually makes once we start looking at this stuff more closely. And we stopped yesterday, as far as I can remember, looking at chapter 1. Well, actually, the introduction. So, ascent and descent. Let's begin here with 1.2, ascent and descent, the method of political economy. In the relation between abstraction and reality, there are, on the one hand, abstract categories, and on the other, empirical and concrete facts. The task here is to discover the dialectics between them. Without it, the claim for dialectics remains a mere melange of words with little theoretical content. Both reductionism, that is, where every aspect of reality is associated with simplistic or simplified theoretical elements, and empirical eclecticism, where the structure of society is considered to be an eclectic grafting of various fragmented empirical facts, are inevitable with a proper understanding of the methodology of abstraction left behind. So, reductionism and empirical eclecticism. Simplified categories are created by reducing chaotic reality. These categories should then work as the conceptual element to reconstitute reality. In this way, the chaotic, concrete reality of capitalism is synthesized into a theoretical whole. This method is concisely summarized by Marx in the Grundrisse. As a proper understanding is crucial for the discussions to follow, I quote the relevant section in full. Now, it seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, the real precondition, thus to begin in economics with example, e.g. the population, which is the foundation and the subject of the entire social act of production. However, on closer examination, this proves to be false. This proves false. The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes, in turn, are an empty phrase if I'm not familiar with the elements on which they rest. For example, wage labor, capital, etc. These latter elements, in turn, presuppose exchange, division of labor, prices, etc. For example, capital is nothing without wage labor, without value, money, price, etc. Thus, if I were to begin with the population, this would be a chaotic conception of the whole, and I would find then by means of further determination, move analytically towards ever more simple concepts, from the imagined concrete towards ever thinner abstractions, until I arrived at the simplest determinations. So from the imagined concrete towards ever thinner abstractions. From there, the journey would have to be retraced until I had finally arrived at the population again, but this time not as the chaotic conception of a whole, but as a rich totality of many determinations and relations. The former is the path historically followed by economics at the time of its origins. The economists of the 17th century, for example, always begin with the living whole, with population, nation, state, several states, etc., but they always conclude by discovering through analysis a small number of determinate, abstract, general relations, such as division of labor, money, value, etc. As soon as these individual moments had been more or less firmly established and abstracted, there began the economic systems, which ascended from the simple relations. So, economic systems ascending from simple relations such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange value, to the level of state, exchange between nations, and the world market. The latter is obviously the scientifically correct method. The concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration. As a result, not as a point of departure, even though it is the point of departure in reality, and hence also the point of departure for observation and conception. Along the first path, the full conception was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along the second path, the abstract determinations lead toward a reproduction of the concrete by way of thought. So you can see there's a circuit described here. This is from the Grundrisse. Note that even though money is ubiquitous and always accompanies the capitalist mode of production, Marx does not assume the existence of money a priori from the beginning. B, ascent and descent. The statement above, this close quote above, the statement above tells us two important things about the methodology of Marxist social science. Figure 1.1. First, in formulating the theoretical body of political economy, the scientifically correct method is to set out from a more abstract and simpler category, then proceed to more concrete and complex categories, not the other way around. Okay, so it's beginning with the abstract, moving to the concrete. The reason for this is simple. A more complex category always needs to be explained, or at least supported by preceding simpler categories. Otherwise, the more complex category remains hollow and unsubstantiated. In order to substantiate the more complex category, we must turn to a simpler one. And unless the simpler category is already established and explained as such substantiation is not possible. The logical process of proceeding from a simpler to a more complex category is called ascending. So you can see here in figure 1.1, chaotic reality, space, and sort of needs to be explained, right? So descent from chaos in space. But the whole ascent here, this big arrow, right? Big arrow moves from commodity, use value plus value, money, labor, power, surplus value, price, class, and finally, brief, social process of capitalism in space. So descent, then ascent, right? And then the explanation of the rich totality of the capitalist society. So there's all this reality, it needs to be sort of framed, understood, abstracted, but made concrete. Yes? So you can sort of see how the dialectic kind of operates. You're confronted with a chaotic reality, you bring to it or begin to ascend, not unlike the Platonic cave, yes. So this has as it were, a Hegelian construct, right? Somewhere. A diagram exhibits the method of political economy. The diagram is a cloud at the top with the words chaotic reality. There are four lines going down from that cloud. The lines are labeled descent. At the bottom of the lines are the words commodity, use value, plus value. There is a line going up from the words commodity, use value, plus value. The line is labeled ascent. The line goes up to the words explanation of the rich totality of the capitalist society. There are words in between the lines, such as money, labor power, surplus value, price, class, and the social process of capitalism in space. So the method of political economy is this one cloud-like respiratory, to use, recall David Harvey's approach to using the water cycle, right? Same thing. And of course, our author here studied with David Harvey, so you can sort of see where he got that from in that sense. The method of political economy, right? Now, the motive power that carries this process of ascent forward is the dialectical relations among the categories, as well as the relations between categories and reality. The whole theoretical body of Capital, the book, volume, forms a continual ascending logical path from the simplest category, that is the commodity, the front end, explained at the very beginning of Capital, to the more complicated, the category of social class, explained at the end of Volume 3. The categories in this logical path are an interdependent whole forming a systematic theory. Interdependent whole forming a systematic theory. Thus, none of the categories of this logical path can be isolated from the theoretical body of Capital as a whole. This Marxian method of dialectical materialism is formulated by inverting Hegelian transcendental idealism and bringing this into the material context. Therefore, the categories in political economy are not idealistic products taken from a transcendental world, but are firmly rooted in reality. Marx states as follows, quote, "My dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it." Recall our issue with the young Hegelians. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of, quote unquote, the idea, is the creator of the real world. Process of thinking is the creator of the real world. And the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With Marx, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man, camera obscura, remember, and translated into forms of thought. It's Capital Volume 1, page 102. This is, of course, the earlier edition, right? This being the method, close quote, this being the methodology of Marxist dialectics, a category forming an element in each logical step of ascent is obtained through a process of abstraction from empirical reality. Marx states, in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of assistance. The power of abstraction must replace both microscopes and chemical reagents. The process of abstraction from reality is called descent, which constitutes the other element of the methodology of Marxist economics. Consider how many commodity transactions are carried out every day. Clearly, the category commodity is real. Not an imagined one taken from reality by the abstracting power of the human brain. Although the logical process of the ascent of the political economy may seem to be a transcendental and autogenous unfolding of categories. This unfolding is only possible by means of the descent that is repeatedly taking place to obtain these categories. Thus, Marx selected England, where the capitalist mode of production was developed as a locus classicus, as a geographical area for his fieldwork, namely the 300 miles from Dover. C, their dialectical unity. To understand the dialectical unity of ascent and descent is the core of Marxist economics, of the methodology of Marxist economics that spans the bridge, mixed metaphor, spans the bridge between theory and reality. In the first instance, a generalized term or raw material to be transformed into a real category is taken from chaotic reality, the big cloud up there, through the method of empirical observation and generalized through the process of descent. Through this process of descent, the eventual category is embodied with material, and the whole theoretical process of ascent is substantiated with the material. It is not arbitrary to take the empirically generalized terms or conceptual moments into the theoretical framework. It's not arbitrary to take the empirically generalized terms or conceptual moments into the theoretical framework. The order is determined by the logical process of ascent. The moment that is simpler and more basic is to be chosen prior to that which is the more complex, presupposing a more extensive logical support of simpler categories. Then all these moments extracted from chaotic reality are put into the theoretical system. The moments then turn to be the real category, and the chain of categories comes onto the logical path of ascent. So it's a very long way to get there, but you can sort of see what he's thinking about. And, if you recall what David Harvey was talking about, this makes, a perfect sense, right? It rains, the water table, the ocean, the clouds, etc. Thus, although the logical path of ascent in political economy seems to be the autonomous unfolding of the idee in Hegelian philosophy, this outlook is merely a way to grasp material reality in a systematic manner. This dialectical unity of ascent and descent is surmised by Mita, 1963. Quote, we must acquire a category by way of an analysis of the given reality. In the ascent from abstract to concrete categories, consecutive analysis of reality is conducted at the same time, which eventually reaches the scientific cognition of the capitalist mode of production as a whole or that of a particular nation. Close quote. Now, note that this is similar to the methodological process described by critical realism. Category and reality mentioned here should, of course, include those categories and realities of, yes, the discipline of economic geography. 1.3, the unified dialectics of ascent and descent in the opening chapter of Capital Volume 1. A, the Marxist way of developing the plan of the book Capital. This book follows that is on subsumption, follows Lefebvre's method of following Capital's plan in dealing with space, with the addition of more robust logics. Marx's plan of Capital is constructed in ascending dialectical steps. In order to develop the spatial theory in line with Marx's plan, it is essential to grasp that the dialectics of ascent and descent is exactly what Marx used to develop the economic theory of capital of the book. To endorse what I have discussed, let me briefly demonstrate how this unified process of ascent and descent is conducted at the beginning of Volume 1 of Capital, where the commodity, that is the first category in which bourgeois wealth presents itself, the Grundrisse, page 881, is discussed with respect to commodities in general and a special kind of commodity that is money. Marx states as follows: the wealth of societies in which the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Quote, the commodity, unquote, quote, the commodity form, commodity-form, is the most general and the most undeveloped form of bourgeois production, close quote. In these statements, the unity of ascent and descent is already clear. The category commodity is taken from the empirical fact that there is an immense collection of them in capitalist society. Meanwhile, the commodity logically forms the most elementary and the most general forms of the capitalist mode of production. The two constituent elements of the general form of capital are M-C-M prime, where C and M, that is capital C and capital M, are both commodities. Uppercase C, uppercase M, are both commodities, that is capital consisting of various kinds of commodities. So MCM consists of commodities, right? The category of capital thus presupposes the category of commodity, but the commodity can be explained without presupposing the category of capital. Now that sounds like it makes no sense, but you can see from a kind of evolving circuit what that might be. It's constantly being sort of transformed. It evolves. For this reason, the category of commodity must precede that of capital. This is the discovery that Marx makes, or the decision that Marx makes in when he gets to the second edition of Capital. To describe capital in that way at the front end. Nevertheless, the category of commodity, even though it is most general and elementary, does not explain everything, since many aspects of reality in the capitalist mode of production have been distilled away in order to obtain it. In order to obtain facts that cannot be explained in this most general category, we need to go a step further. That is, introducing a commodity with particular characteristics, and that is money. This process of incorporating more complex terms into a simple category is the process of ascent. B, how Marx deduced the category of money in the book Capital, the volume Capital. The dialectical nature of the process of ascent from a simple category like commodity in general to money, a more complex one, is demonstrated in Marx's explanation in the following manner. The process of ascent in this respect involves two different paths: the value form and the process of exchange. First, the value form sets out from the, quote, simple, isolated, or accidental form of value, close quote. X commodity A equals Y commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat. Where the first commodity plays an active role, the second a passive one. The value of the first commodity is represented as a relative value. In other words, the commodity is in the relative form of value. The second commodity fulfills the function of equivalent. In other words, it is in the equivalent form. For example, you could say a process of exchange occurs within the transformation, right? Commodity A, commodity B. Marx then expands this into the total or expanded form of value. That is, Z commodity A equals U commodity B, or V commodity C, or W commodity D, or X commodity E, etc. Nevertheless, this form of value has defects. It can never be the exhaustive form to explain the relations among different kinds of concrete useful labor, which form as a totality a social division of labor. Nor can the elements constituting this form of value be connected to one another for a total system. In order to acquire a better logical vantage point, which commands the social division of labor in totality, Marx introduces the general form of value, where values of all the commodities are expressed through one single kind of commodity. According to Marx, the simple and expanded forms of value are a motley mosaic of disparate and unconnected expressions of value, and are the only equivalent forms which exist. And the only equivalent forms which exist are limited ones, and the specific concrete useful kind of labor contained in each particular commodity equivalent is only a particular kind of labor, and therefore not an exhaustive form of appearance of human labor in general. The general form of value, which overcomes these defects, has the following formula. So let me break here for a moment and just say, this is where you begin to see the understanding or awareness of the difference between labor and labor power. Okay, so following formula: 1 coat, 10 pounds of tea, 40 pounds of coffee, a quarter of corn, 2 ounces of gold, half a ton of iron, all equal 20 yards of linen. Yes, we've looked at that to exhaustion. It is from this formula that Marx obtains the money form, where the universal equivalent of value, that is 20 yards of linen in the right-hand side of this equation, is replaced with 2 ounces of gold. Now, in this argument of value form, Marx shows why a mere mineral substance, that is gold, takes the general form of value in a commodity-producing society. The expression of value in money form, the money commodity, right? For example, 10 pounds of tea equals 2 ounces of gold is nothing but a developed form of the simple form of value. Therefore, the ultimate secret behind the fetish form of money lies in these simple value forms constituted by the social division of labor under commodity production. Second, Marx considers the explanation not to be complete, however, unless the actual process of exchange carried out by the economic agencies in various branches of the social division of labor under commodity production is analyzed, and the real contradiction in the exchange of commodities is discovered. In order to complete the explanation, the social process, which actually attempts to transcend footnote 1, the contradiction inherent in the social division of labor under commodity production, that is, the contradiction between use value and value in the commodity transaction, needs to be examined. So there's a contradiction between use value and value in the commodity transaction. In the following, the nature of this dialectic and the way of its transcendence are examined. In a system of the social division of labor, the labor spent in the production process only counts insofar as it is useful for others in society. Under the system of commodity production, all the commodities produced are non-use values to the producer, but other agencies in the market who do not produce them seek use values in these commodities. So you're making something, doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot to you, and in fact, kind of annoying to keep them around, but somewhere else there is a need. The relation in the social division of labor under commodity production requires that all the commodities in society must change owners. The relation between market agencies in which the commodity is exchanged is mediated only with value. In other words, commodities must be realized as values before they can be realized as use values. Nevertheless, for commodities to be realized as value, they must prove themselves as having use value. However, it is only the act of exchange, that is, actions of the market agencies, that can prove whether labor spent in the production process is useful for others, with the product consequently taking part in the social division of labor. Thus, a commodity must prove its use value before it is realized as value. But in the meantime, the same commodity must prove itself as value before it is proven that the commodity has use value. So this is a dialectic inherent in commodity production. There's a kind of promise of ability or capability of use value. And then, of course, after you get it back after Amazon delivers it, you discover that it's screwed. Hence, the producer expects the products to function as the universal equivalent for all other commodities, i.e., the right term of the equation 1.1. But since every market agency hopes this, they hope this. There is in fact, no commodity acting as the universal equivalent. In their difficulties, our commodity owners think like Faust. In the beginning was the deed. They have therefore already acted before thinking. Capital Volume 1, page 180. Only with the assistance of money, or to be more precise, only after relating all of the commodities to this particular kind of commodity as the universal equivalent, can the market agencies mutually bring their commodities into relation as values, thus as commodities. As Marx states, quote, only the action of society can turn a particular commodity into the universal equivalent. The social action of all other commodities therefore sets apart the particular commodity in which they all represent their values. Through the social process, it becomes a specific social function of the commodity which has been set apart to be universal equivalent. In the social division of labor under commodity production, a particular commodity, which is gold in many societies, yet sometimes also silver or shell, comes to be set out as money through the action of society. Marx thus succeeded in explaining money by incorporating the fact that in real society, that a particular commodity had been extracted and deployed as the universal equivalent, money, since ancient times. In this process, three things are clear. First, the logical process of assent is carried out by the means of contradiction within a simpler category. In this case, the contradiction between the use value and the value of the commodity, the contradiction between the two things. Second, it is not ideal speculation, but actual human action over centuries that plays a crucial role in transcending this contradiction inherent in the category. Third, the direction in which the contradiction is transcended is determined by means of the process of descent. That is, money, the universal equivalent, is not the product of an ideal imagination, but is taken from empirical reality through the process of descent. There are hundreds of thousands of monetary transactions carried out by commodity owners every day. In this sense, a new category, money, is explained by the means of the utility of two methods, ascent and descent. Through this process, an abstract theoretical category develops toward the theoretical reconstruction of reality, which is not as a chaotic conception of facts, but a rich totality of actual social relations determined by the interrelations of categories of various complexities at various stages of ascent. More complex categories crucial in explaining the capitalist mode of production, like labor, power, capital, absolute and relative forms of surplus value, wages, capital accumulation, etc., are successively introduced into the theoretical framework of political economy in this manner. The framework thus gains in strength of explanatory power approaching infinitesimally close to the rich totality of many determinations and relations. Herein lies the logic of the dialectic between concrete reality and abstract theory. Through continuing efforts of this sort, the process of theoretical ascent, supported by the abstracting process of descent, is carried out step by step. Continued efforts of this sort, that is, the process of theoretical ascent, supported by the abstracting process of descent, is carried out step by step while maintaining the dialectical relationship between reality and abstract theory. Thereby, we can ultimately obtain a theoretical reconstruction of reality without retreating into the labyrinth of eclecticism. 1.4, formal and real subsumption, the dialectical process to incorporate a fresh logical moment into Marxist theory. Now, Marx did not write much about space, except for a few, albeit insightful passages. The task to bring space as the theoretical moment into the body of Marxist economic theory has been left to later Marxist researchers. Yet Marx left us with the dialectical logic, which should be followed when a fresh, so far exogenous, conceptual moment. An exogenous conceptual moment is incorporated into the existing theoretical body of Marxism. Subsumption consists of another logical driving force of ascent. The two logical stages of the dialectic, whereby something that existed before the emergence of capitalism is incorporated into the capitalist mode of production, are called by Marx formal subsumption and real subsumption. The concept of subsumption was first put forward by Marx in his Results of the Immediate Process of Production. Although Marx theorized subsumption only with respect to production technology that took place at the dawn of the capitalist mode of production, this concept is powerful enough to be extended to wider conceptual moments, including space. The takeover by capital of something that exists outside capitalism is termed formal subsumption. The takeover by capital of something that exists outside of capitalism is termed formal subsumption. For example, the formal subsumption of labor under capital is the takeover by capital of the mode of labor developed before the emergence of capitalist relations. The labor process itself is an antediluvian social phenomenon. It's not an invention of capitalism. Capitalism rather first inherits the labor processes existing before it erupts. Marx explains this point as follows. Capital subsumes the labor process as it finds it. That is to say, it takes over an existing labor process developed by different and more archaic modes of production, and it is evident that capital took over an available established labor process, close quote. Capitalism first takes the labor process for granted and subsumes it formally into it. Capitalism then transforms it into the shape most suitable and fit to be an integral part of the capitalist mode of production. The division of labor in manufacturing, for example, reacts back upon that in society and develops and multiplies it further. It creates machines and eventually a large-scale industry. This is the process of the real subsumption of the labor process on the foundation of a formally subsumed labor process. The nature of the labor process is transformed through the development of the forces of production and the purposeful application of science and technology. So you could say, without getting too crazy about it, it is this idea that, you have a kind of assimilation or integration, a kind of praxis, as it were, this kind of assimilated assumption. It's phenomenological in that sense. Now, anyway, back to the text. Through the real subsumption of the labor process, the capitalist mode of production establishes itself as a mode of production sui generis and brings into being a new mode of material production. In large-scale industry, for example, the labor process is subsumed into capitalism in real terms and transformed into cooperation and the division of labor within a firm which is specific to the capitalist labor process. Through this change, technology and organization in the labor process are totally revolutionized, creating a condition for further development of capitalist relations of production. In short, one of the first tasks of industrial capital is to subsume all of these forms existing before the emergence of capitalism in a formal manner, and then transform them in a real manner. That is real subsumption. Marx himself summarizes this process. Quote, capital encounters these older forms in the epoch of its formation and development. It encounters them as antecedents, but not as antecedents established by itself, nor as forms of its own life process in the same way as it originally finds the commodity already in existence, but not as its own product, and likewise finds money circulation, but not as an element in its own reproduction. These forms must be first destroyed as independent forms and subordinated to industrial capital. So this is a way of thinking, a way of thinking about manipulation of forms, of prior historical forms, and the ways in which they can be transformed. All right, anyway, close quote. And that was a quote from Theories of Surplus Value. Now, back to the text. The concept of subsumption can be expanded to the incorporation of many exogenous physical substances and natural systems into society. That is, ecosystem, human body, physical landscape features, rivers, mountains, space, to name such a few. So, expanded into incorporation of many exogenous physical substances and natural systems. Through subsumption, society transforms the nature and the processes of pre-existing and pristine natural substances into those generating no obstacles to it. 1 point, spaceless society thus reproduces the property of its configuration and the property of its exogenous physical substances, or space, through subsumption, so that the obstacles in the exogenous pristine space can be negated. Thereby, the produced space is made to serve the requirements of the society. It is just like God created man in his own image, as it says in Genesis. These dialectics exist also with respect to space, the unique logical moment of Marxist geography. The capitalist mode of production, whether it emerges as a transcendence of the contradiction in the feudal mode of production or is created on a virgin land, as in the so-called New World, settler colonialism, has to inherit this pristine space. Capitalism first subsumes pristine antediluvian space formally, then subsumes it in a real manner in a form suitable to itself through intentional applications of science and technology and the creation of new social relations. 1.5, the classification of science. The body of theory that has subsumed space has a unique set of logics. Thus, it can set itself as a relatively independent field or discipline in pursuance to the Marxist concept of the classification of science. In Marxist philosophy, each branch of science can secure, this is Kantianism, right? Can secure its relatively independent position if it reflects and studies a relatively autonomous form of motion in the material world. Friedrich Engels states as follows, quote, classification of the sciences, each of which analyzes a single form of motion or a series of forms of motion that belong together and pass into one another, is therefore the classification, the arrangement of these forms of motion themselves according to their inherent sequence. Just as one form of motion develops out of another, so their reflections, the various sciences, must arise necessarily out of one another, close quote. This proposition comes from one of the three laws of dialectics. Recall, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. Suppose we divide a living creature into smaller portions. The creature divided beyond a certain limit can no longer survive. A living body transforms itself into a non-living organic mass. If we continue dividing the organic mass, we eventually obtain a molecule. The further division of a molecule ends up with the atom. The large part of the body, a molecule and an atom, are all the substances with different forms of motion, studied by different branches of sciences, biology, chemistry, and nuclear physics. Engels summarizes this relation as follows, quote, the purely quantitative operation of division has a limit at which it becomes transformed into a qualitative difference. A qualitative difference. The mass consists solely of molecules, but is something essentially different from the molecule, just as the latter is different from the atom. It is this difference that is the basis for the separation of sciences, the differences between among biology, chemistry, and physics, for example, or the idea that the connection among them is not something wholly abstract, but has actual, material consequence. That's that whole business, as in Bellamy Foster's discussion of the increasing or evolutionary improvement of the concept of biology in the 19th century, and particularly biology and then biochemistry. Thus, the academic division of labor is, according to dialectical materialism, not an ideal product nor a matter of expediency, but is firmly rooted in the objective and material forms of motion and concomitant contradictions. Motion and concomitant contradiction. Societal relations and their forms of motion are no exceptions. The particular form of motion mentioned above, dealt with in each section of the academic division of labor, is characterized by a logical moment unique to it. For instance, a molecule or an atom, Marxist geography, must have such a moment, a real category intrinsic to the theory of capitalism at the departure of the logical process of ascent. Applying the formulation of Engels, we can infer that Marxist geography has a position as a relatively independent field of Marxist social science, since it has a qualitatively distinguishable single form, or a series of forms of motion related to space in capitalist society, and has its own unique contradiction. Now, behind this point of departure in the process of ascent lies the aspatial theory of capitalism, and beyond this point, the theory of Marxist economic geography unfolds. So I've gotten to the end of my time today, and we'll look at chapter 2 tomorrow because even you may not think so, but it's actually kind of interesting. uh, Tomorrow we will begin to look at chapter 2. But let me leave you with a quote anyway. The sum of the arguments of this book will confirm the statement that social relations and struggles against them, which are concrete abstractions, have no real existence save in and through space. Their underpinning is spatial. That's Lefebvre. Exposing the spatial underpinnings of power relations and the struggles contesting them is the ultimate task of this book on subsumption. So that's kind of the point of doing this. And so we stopped looking at Fujio Mizuoka book on subsumption. Tomorrow we will look at chapter 2. It has an abstract. This chapter examines the logical point of departure and the fundamental material base of Marxist geography. That is physical space. The nature of pristine space free from human action is presented in the Euclidean axioms of geometry, summarized into the dual and contradictory attributes of pristine space, absolute and relative. The absolute space has contiguousness, homogeneity, isotropy, and accepts anything as a container. However, relative space, the container, the Schrödingerian cat is, kind of the subject to a container in one sense. Anyway, however, relative space has the property of separation differentiation, which individuates anything in space. So you have space, has this sort of an approach to infinity. And then there's something that individuates within that context. These two attributes are thus in contradiction, while they are unified in physical space. The dialectics of separation within unity. That's one of those, law things, right? Dialectical laws. In a class society, the physical space with these attributes is placed under power. That is the whole difference of having shelter, having freedom of movement. All of those things are there. So anyway, we will continue on with this tomorrow. Let me end our little thing here currently. And thank you for your attention. I hope you found this useful and or interesting.